Hi, my name is Mark Beasley. I'm the Alan T. Dixon Professor of Accounting, and I'm also the Director of the Enterprise Risk Management Initiative in the Poole College of Management. And I'm very pleased to be joined by two of my colleagues here at NC State, Matt Koci, who is Professor of Viral Immunology at NC State, and David Rasmussen, who is Associate Professor of Plant Pathology and Entomology. Thank y'all for being here. Do you mind just setting the stage with the terms pathogen, pathology, or virology? I know those are terms we hear all the time, but maybe just get us on the same page.
Sure. Well, and I guess first, thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. Yeah, so pathology, pathogen, viruses, virology, those terms have entered the sort of common use a lot more in the last 5 years than probably the last 50. Everybody's probably got a good sense of what they are, but just sort of to level set. So a pathogen is any microorganism, so parasite, fungus, bacteria, virus, that causes a disease. And then David and I both work on viruses, so viruses and virology. Virology is just the $5 way of saying the study of viruses, and so virologists are the people who do that studying.
So you're doing it sort of from an animal, poultry angle, and then David, you're doing it from plants. So tell us a little bit more about your work here at NC State, and then we'll turn to David to do the same.
Sure. So yeah, my group is interested in sort of the arms race that happens between pathogens, but specifically viruses, and the people or animals that they infect. And so what is it about one virus versus another that's able to cause a disease? And then what is it about the human or the animal's immune response that helps protect the animal from that pathogen, and sort of the dance that happens between those two as they each try to sort of outcompete each other evolutionarily.
And David, you're sort of coming at it from a plant perspective, so tell us what you do.
Yes, I'm also a virologist, but I study viruses from a more epidemiological perspective. So whereas Matt studies sort of what happens between viruses and animal immune systems, I study viruses at the population level, how they spread host to host, and what factors might drive their spread or hinder their spread. And my particular specialty is in what we call genomic epidemiology, which is using pathogen genomic data to track their spread. My background was originally in human infectious diseases. I worked a lot on human RNA viruses like HIV, influenza, and dengue. But when I started here in 2018, my group started to focus more on agricultural pathogens, especially plant infecting RNA viruses, in recognition of how important these RNA viruses are to plant health and in turn our own well-being, since we rely on plants for our food and our whole agroeconomy.
Yeah, and you're a part of a group, we refer to it as a cluster. Can you talk about that just a second?
Yeah, along with 3 other faculty members here at NC State, I'm part of the Emerging Plant Disease and Global Food Security cluster, which combines expertise both in virology as well as in other things like epidemiology and using things like sensors and other diagnostic tools to find plants that are infected.
So Matt, you referred to the use of the terms viruses and pathogens have become a sort of an everyday term, and you helped us sort of level set that. But we all, unfortunately, sort of have gone through this recent experience of the COVID pandemic, and people like me are like, I hope I never see that again, and hope, we had the Spanish flu 100 years ago. So people sort of think of it as a 100-year event. Help us understand, is that how you would see viruses, from a 100-year event perspective, or based on the work you do, how would you see it?
Well, it seems right now, whether it's pandemics or otherwise, we seem to be living through a lot of 100-year events sort of stacked on top of each other. For the most part, yeah, pandemics seem to be paced out about every 3 or 4 generations, roughly 100 or so years. That's less about specific time intervals and more a reflection of just, I think, the low probability of viruses mutating in a way. So most viruses that we worry about in human disease right now pretty much all came from an animal host at some point. Mm-hmm. And so the challenges it takes, or the pressures of those viruses under to mutate in a way that then allows them to spread to humans, and not just spread to one human, but then also have the ability to spread to multiple humans, those circumstances only really sort of seem to align about once every 100 years but there's nothing specific or magical about 100 years. It could happen tomorrow, or it could happen 200 years from now. It's just a matter of when do the stars align in a way that leads to another COVID pandemic.
So, and I guess you would probably tell us, viruses are out there all the time, everywhere. Is that how y'all see it? I mean, David, is that consistent with your view of it?
Definitely. I think what it makes it so hard to predict when we're going to see the next big pandemic is that pandemics rely on a bunch of individually rare events all happening together at the right time. So as Matt alluded to, a virus might have to jump between species, or maybe even more than one species. A virus might have to, say, jump from a bat into a pig, and then a human, and then that virus would have to escape that host's immune system long enough to actually be transmitted onto the next host, and then so on and so forth. So the probability that any one virus is going to do all those things at one time is extremely unlikely. But what we do know is that these zoonotic spillover events, where a virus is jumping from wildlife or domesticated animals into humans, is happening all the time. I have some South African colleagues who like to refer to it as the ears of the hippo. It's hard to predict when a hippo is going to pop its head out from underneath the water. But what we do know for sure is that there's a whole lot of hippo biomass lurking underneath the water. And in that analogy, what's lurking underneath the water are all these viruses that are constantly popping up and coming into humans. We just don't know when the next big major event is going to occur.
So, Matt, when you think about it, well, when I think about it, it's ignorance sort of is my defense. But, it's what I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. When you think about a general layperson out there, and I would represent that person, what would you want me to know that would catch my attention, help grab my attention, why I should care about paying attention to viruses and pathogens in the world?
Well, hopefully, everybody's lived experiences 5 years ago is exhibit one.
Yeah.
And to David's point of, viruses are always out there doing what they do. People are hunting for them, trying to otherwise figure out who's there, how are they mutating. Most people don't recognize or realize or really have any reason to appreciate, besides those who work in infectious diseases, that most of the diseases we're worried about of humans came from animals at some point. And whether they finally figured out how to unlock the door to otherwise become a human pandemic, or just become sort of a regional, localized epidemic infection that's only sort of a problem for one part of the world, that's part of the challenge for infectious disease, biology, and medicine at large, is to run all these hippos down and try and figure out which one's about to come up above the waterline and who's going to just sort of stay lurking underneath.
And David, I know you're looking at it from a plant perspective. I guess I have a simple question. Could the virus hop from a plant to a human?
Yes. Fortunately, Mark, what we know is that it'd be very difficult for any plant virus to hop immediately into humans, simply because these viruses don't have the ability to replicate in our cells and spread through our bodies. But a plant virus or other plant pathogen could cause major indirect problems for human health. For example, there's been multiple plant viruses that have emerged in Africa, for example, that infect cassava crops, and people in especially Eastern Africa rely a whole lot on cassava as a staple crop. Closer to home, for example, there's been viruses that have emerged in citrus recently. So citrus tetraza virus was a virus that emerged in the Florida citrus industry back in the late 1990s and then in the 2000s as well, and caused a whole lot of damage, including not only killing individual trees, but wiping out whole orchards. And that's now been followed up in the Florida citrus industry by another emerging pathogen, citrus greening, which is now killing even more citrus trees. And of course, there's the possibility of a huge, major viral plant pandemic or other plant pathogen causing sort of a pandemic scale event. For example, you can imagine if there was a newly emerging major pathogen of, say, wheat or rice or corn, any of those major commodity crops or major grains, it could cause global economic stability and even political instability, right? But I don't want to catastrophize too much, because I don't think we really understand what's the actual probability or risk of a major plant pandemic like that occurring anytime in the near future. But I like to try and, have people relate to this by thinking about the foods that they most enjoy eating, whether that's their orange juice for breakfast or their coffee or their chocolate, or even the wine grapes that produce the wine.
Oh, there you go.
Like you're drinking, right? Like if a major plant pathogen infected any of these crops, it would be devastating for us at the individual level, as well as probably devastating for the farmers and growers who rely on these crops for their livelihood.
And then the products that rely on those ingredients. So that could be a part of my supply chain, that I need a particular ingredient for the product I make, and it could be affected by that. So,
Well, and I think that's an excellent point that David made in terms of humans. We tend to be pretty egocentric and are only really worried about the things that affect us directly. And so we tend to ignore the stuff that affects plants or affects animals without really realizing that on a large enough scale, wiping out corn, wiping out, chickens affects egg prices.
Right.
There are diseases of swine that we're worried about coming to North America that would otherwise make bacon ridiculously expensive. There are all these things. There's one particular poultry virus that kills enough chickens in the developing world that the WHO lists as a threat to human health because it suppresses protein nutrition in human populations because it kills so many chickens. And so there are ripple effects to these things that are more than just us getting sick.
yeah. When you think about that, what should I maybe be worried about? And I'll translate that over to say, what worries you? What sort of keeps you up at night? And maybe we start with a more near-term issue, and that's bird flu. Is there anything that sort of we should be paying attention to there, that we should be paying attention to there, or that you're focused in on, that we're tied to the bird flu topic?
I'll let the epidemiologist go first.
Yes. Well, Matt is the acknowledged expert on the bird flu, but I think what's scary about the bird flu is, we don't really understand how easy it would be for any variant of the bird flu to get into humans and then become highly transmissible. We know the virus can jump from birds and other animals into humans, but while it may be highly pathogenic and virulent and cause a whole lot of sort of pain and suffering in that first host, so far we haven't seen many variants that can actually spread host to host. So the bird flu seems to be sort of epidemiologically constrained at the human population level, where it hasn't quite figured out how to jump from human to human just yet.
Yeah. How about Matt?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's an important topic or important point. This flavor of bird flu, the H5N1, and various versions of it have been around since the late 90s. That's not proof that it can never figure out how to spread from human to human, but the fact that it's been around for as long as it has, and it still hasn't, given that it spread through Asia, through Europe, and now into North America. So there's clearly some sort of one other additional barrier or some trade-off it has to make that may, as it gets better at infecting humans, that may mean it's less fit to do something else, and evolutionarily it just can't otherwise make that jump. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean flu won't eventually figure it out. It might, but on top of what we see in the news about what's happening with egg prices and in poultry and sort of the spillover that's recently happened into cows. The other thing that I'm paying attention to is we're finding in a lot of wild mammals and a lot of wild birds here in North America that we've never seen it in before. And so whether or not that's just the virus testing out different hosts and maybe it's going to become a virus of coyotes or whatever the case may be, or if that's some sort of harbinger that, I like to use the Michael Crichton Jurassic Park, analogy. It's the velociraptor sort of testing the fences, trying to figure out where can it break loose.
Weak point. Yeah. We talk about the bird flu, but how about bigger issues that worry you? What else would you sort of say is on your mind as you think about this broad topic?
Yeah, I think there's, a short list of known knowns that we know presents an incredible threat to human and animal health. Things like coronaviruses and influenza viruses, And there's a similar short list of pathogens on the plant side that we worry about, things like new emerging strains of Phytophthora or new wheat blasts that could have devastating effects on a global food supply. But the thing that keeps me up at night, worrying more than any of these highly specific threats, are more about our capacity to respond to these newly emerging threats. Because for any newly emerging pathogen, we would have to do several things well, right? We'd have to have some basic surveillance system in place to figure out where the pathogen is spreading and who's getting infected, and hopefully who is infecting those people or plants. And then in order to be able to control the pathogen, we'd have to do a good job of testing people and having diagnostics that can quickly assess whether individuals are infected or not, so we can start to control the pathogen at the local level. And then hopefully we'd also need new pharmaceutical interventions as well, things like new vaccines or new antivirals to actually control the virus itself. And I'm worried since we all have a bit of sort of COVID post-pandemic fatigue that we're not doing as good of a job as we should of keeping on track of all those different avenues of research and development.
Yeah, our memories start fading, don't they? Yeah. Matt, any sort of bigger ticket items that are on your mind?
Well, to dovetail with that, I think how we pay for healthcare in this country sort of limits our ability to do that. Pre-COVID and now even post-COVID, we've all heard, 35,000 people die every year from influenza. We've sort of thought that was just a number we had to live with. During COVID, during the shutdown, there was still COVID, but flu went away. So, I'm not otherwise suggesting we all sort of become hermits to get rid of influenza, but there were no flu deaths in the United States during the shutdown. So there are things we can do to limit the number of flu cases. And so maybe we don't otherwise have to just surrender 35,000 people a year. To David's point, it takes different types of medicines, it takes different types of diagnostics, it takes a different way of approaching how we deal with acute viral infections. Acute viral infections cost the US economy over $100 billion a year. Most of that is from lost work or parents having to stay home because the kids are sick and so on and so forth. And a lot of that too comes from, again, how we pay for healthcare and sort of our play through the pain kind of culture. The employee who shows up sick is sort of more dedicated than the one who takes the day off. Or you work at a place where if you don't show up for your shift, you get fired, and so you have to show up sick. In both of those cases, you show up, you end up infecting your coworkers, you end up infecting your clients, your customers, you help spread the infection around more, and so that's just more folks who end up getting so sick that they can't go to work. And so, during COVID, we built a machine to rapidly identify who had COVID and who didn't. And if you tested positive, you had to stay home for a certain number of days. If you didn't test positive, you could go on to work or whatever else. Honestly, there was the mask and there were other restrictions as well. But we had this system where you could quickly identify who they were. And when you were positive, if you tested positive, you could call your doctor once the antivirals came out, and you could take antivirals. So there's antivirals for flu, but those only really work when you take them at the very beginning of the infection. And what normally works now is you wake up one morning, you got sort of a scratchy throat, I feel like I might be coming down with something. I'll see if I feel worse tomorrow, and then maybe I'll call the doctor or so on and so forth. Or I'll go to the student on campus, skips class to go but doesn't go to student health. The next day they wake up, they feel even worse. They clearly can't go to class or go to work. They call the doctor. Doctor says, yeah, sorry, everybody's in the same boat. I can't see you for another 2 days. So by the time you show up, you feel the worst, but you're probably actually no longer really infectious. You were most infectious and most of a threat to your roommates and your colleagues and whatever else those first 2 days. And so if we had a system, sort of like what David was talking about, where somebody starts to feel ill, they immediately go to CVS, they get one of the antigen tests, they test positive for X, Y, or Z virus, call their doctor, get a prescription, start taking that immediately, we can blunt those infections instead of somebody being sick and sort of walking wounded for a better part of a week to 10 days, maybe it's only 2 or 3 days, and we limit how much it spreads to other people. And we start to eat back and reclaim some of that $100 billion of lost revenue and lost expenses to the U.S. economy. For the most part, because of how we've done things historically, vaccines have been our only real weapon against acute viral infections, again, because you're, for the most part, taking the antivirals too late for them to really be effective. If we start testing and doing more kind of surveillance and set up a system where people are allowed to take time off early so they're not sick longer, then there's a market for pharmaceutical companies to make more antivirals because they know they're going to be effective and they know they're going to get used. Right now, it's vaccines and over-the-counter medicines.
David, you talked a little bit about surveillance. As I think about a business leader, I'm trying to do surveillance on the risks that could be emerging from my business. What are some tips that you would give to help me be better at doing surveillance? Because you do it all the time.
Right. I think this just, the need for surveillance drives from the fact that we really need to understand what's out there and how it's spreading and how many new people are getting infected each day or how many new plants are becoming infected. Otherwise, there's no real rational way of assessing the risk that these pathogens pose to us. We really are flying in the dark. So we obviously need new ways of doing surveillance, but I think of surveillance as like this incredibly non-flashy or sort of unsexy thing that we need to do. And it's sort of unsexy because, for one, it's expensive, right? It's nonstop. We always have to be vigilant and be constantly surveilling plant or animal populations to see what's out there. And even scientifically, it's not very sexy because doing this sort of basic surveillance work doesn't necessarily generate the high profile or very flashy publications. But where I draw hope is that there's obviously room for improvement in how we're doing surveillance. We saw that during the COVID pandemic, for example, where different locations around the country started to roll out these wastewater surveillance programs where now they could do large-scale surveillance of all the pathogens that were in basically our sewage, including coronaviruses, very cost-effectively and at scale. But I think for other types of pathogens, especially for pathogens that don't go through our gastrointestinal tract and literally wind up in our wastewater, we still need to figure out what is the equivalent of sort of those low-cost but efficient ways of doing mass-scale surveillance.
So you were talking about that surveillance concept. What was coming to mind from a risk management perspective, we talk about a lot of what is currently unknown to me but is knowable if I will spend the time trying to gather that information about whatever issue. And that's sort of what you're saying is let's spend the time doing surveillance to better understand what we don't know, and it's constantly changing. Matt, any thoughts for you about actions people could take?
I guess two. One, to follow up on David's point too. I mean, we think of surveillance as being expensive because when it works, nothing happens. And so it's hard to justify the cost when it's worked the way it's supposed to. And so it's always sort of the push and pull of, well, the more surveillance you do, the more likely we're to learn how things might be starting to go off the rails and be able to nudge it back into
Sort of self-correct it pretty quickly.
and then we don't have a pandemic or we don't have an outbreak or we don't have a major catastrophe or whatever it happens to be. But when it doesn't happen, then folks are always wondering, well, why are we wasting all that money? Because you can't sort of necessarily prove that was the reason why nothing happened.
Right.
I mean, we're seeing that same kind of mindset or whatever else. So the other thing that I would say people can do is get vaccinated. Vaccines have been one of the most impactful inventions in human history. It's probably saved more lives than just about anything next to indoor plumbing and the flushable toilet. The fact that it's been so successful, we now have people who talk about how why do I need this vaccine because I've never seen that particular disease. Well, yeah, you've never seen that particular disease because of the vaccine. Right. And so this idea of, well, it's never happened, so I don't otherwise need the vaccine. And vaccines in themselves end up having spillover effects that we didn't otherwise anticipate. It's like in the case of the influenza vaccine, which from year to year isn't necessarily the most effective vaccine that we've got. There are others that are much more effective. But when people have done longitudinal sort of what life factor variables best correlate with early mortality or longer lifespans, consistently getting the flu vaccine has been one thing that correlates with living longer. Wow. And it's not so much about not getting the flu or protecting you from flu death. The theory is actually even when it's not 100% effective in terms of preventing infection, it prevents how severe the virus would have been when it infected you or how long you had that infection. So you have it for a shorter period of time. And flu causes a lot of inflammation. And if you get sort of really bad flu infection every single season, you end up with a lot of cardiovascular damage. And the vaccine actually seems to tamp that down in a way where folks who get the vaccine regularly have less cardiovascular events, less heart attacks, less strokes, and stuff like that. And so the vaccine prevents flu infections, but it also extends your life through other ways that we wouldn't otherwise anticipate. And sort of similarly, right now, measles in the news. Measles is probably one of the most effective vaccines we've had. You take the 2 or 3 shots as a kid, you're protected for life. Again, almost did have it eradicated from the United States. It's now back. But not just protecting you from measles. If you haven't been vaccinated for measles and you get the measles, that virus actually attacks your memory immune cells. So the cells in your immune system that learn different pathogens and then remember them so the next time you get infected, you don't get sick. Measles kills those cells. So if you haven't been vaccinated for measles and then you get infected, you become susceptible to things you've already sort of become immune to, whether it was vaccine or natural infection. So a lot of the severe measles reactions and or even deaths to measles tend to be secondary bacterial infections and pneumonias that your immune system would have otherwise handled just fine, but because the measles took out your memory cells, now you're more susceptible.
Well, this has been fascinating. Overwhelmed by the kind of work you're doing and just impressed by the research that you're doing here at NC State. And thank you for taking time just to share a little bit about that and helping us better understand some of the work you're doing and the implications for all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.